The majority of males attempt to capture feminine attention through material offerings, physical appearance, or superficial charisma, and this precise approach explains their swift erasure from memory. Yet the ancient strategist perceived something far more profound. He recognized a shadowy truth that escapes the comprehension of ordinary individuals. The objective was never about being appreciated or admired. The true aim revolves around becoming permanently etched into her consciousness, not through satisfaction or compliance, but through commanding the emotional landscape she inhabits long after your departure. Throughout this presentation, you shall discover 9 obscure psychological architectures drawn from the teachings of the Renaissance philosopher. These frameworks exist to ignite consuming fixation without uttering a single flattering phrase. No pursuit, no theatrical displays, no desperate pleas for romantic acknowledgement. You shall uncover the methodology for transforming into the individual she struggles to articulate, yet finds impossible to banish from her wandering thoughts. Observe with absolute concentration, because the moment this mechanism reveals itself, you shall permanently abandon the amateur approach that defines the common male experience. The supremacy of apprehension over affection. A declaration exists from the ancient tactician that the vast population of males deliberately overlook, not because the statement lacks validity, but because its implications generate profound discomfort. Remaining an object of trepidation provides far greater security than becoming an object of fondness. Upon initial examination, this philosophy appears merciless, resembling the conviction of an antagonist rather than a worthy individual. However, direct your attention carefully, not toward verbal expressions, but toward observable conduct. Examine the behavioral patterns females demonstrate around various categories of males. Suddenly, that provocative statement achieves crystal clarity. Affection possesses warmth. It carries a gentle, tender quality. This represents the emotional state every human being yearns for, yet simultaneously, the sensation we most readily dismiss as unremarkable. When fondness remains perpetually accessible, constantly generous, eternally gentle, it surrenders its significance. It transforms into ambient static, comfortable, certainly, yet entirely unmemorable. This marks the precise location where the typical male stumbles catastrophically. They maintain the delusion that fondness alone suffices. They cling to the fantasy that increased generosity, expanded vulnerability, and deeper emotional exposure will elevate their perceived worth in her estimation. Yet what actually transpires? She gradually becomes numb to his efforts, because anything distributed without resistance or earned struggle possesses zero influential weight. Now consider the alternative: apprehension. Not the variety that inflicts damage, not vocal aggression, not domineering behavior, not physical intimidation. Such displays represent fragility masquerading as capability. Females detect this deception instantly. Authentic apprehension emerges when a male establishes limitations so unwavering she perceives them without requiring verbal articulation. He maintains no necessity to elevate his vocal volume. He maintains no requirement to engage in conflict. He maintains no obligation to justify his inherent value. He merely withdraws his presence, and the resulting quietude imparts lessons that verbal communication could never deliver. This particular male refuses to pursue. He refuses to elaborate on the source of his wounded feelings. He refuses to implore her to remain by his side. He merely permits her to experience the vacuum created by his departure. And that vacuum strikes with greater force than any eruption of sentiment, because the instant she comprehends his unwavering seriousness, the entire dynamic transforms. She recognizes he shall not compromise his personal principles merely to maintain her proximity. She recognizes that demonstrations of disrespect shall cost her access to him permanently. And precisely at this juncture, attraction metamorphoses into consuming preoccupation, not because he offered additional investment, but because he demonstrated willingness to offer absolutely nothing when his fundamental values faced violation. This constitutes genuine apprehension, not terror of the individual himself, but terror of forfeiting access to a male who exists beyond her manipulation. And here lies the psychological revelation. The majority of females harbor no obsession with receiving affection. Their obsession fixates upon the male who requires no external validation to experience wholeness. This explains feminine pursuit of the male who departs without hesitation. This explains their reverence for the individual who refuses to capitulate. This explains their persistent mental occupation with the male who never descended to supplication. He demonstrated no hostility. He exhibited no viciousness. He simply remained immovable. He possessed something 99% of males entirely lack: principles that carried no negotiable price. Therefore, when the philosopher declared that apprehension provides superior safety compared to affection, he was not dismissing emotional connection. He was instructing you that reverence must establish itself as the foundation, that without apprehension of forfeiture, fondness deteriorates into complacency, and that the most profound longing originates not from what you contribute, but from what you demonstrate readiness to withdraw when she fails to honor it appropriately. Retain this understanding permanently. She may harbor genuine fondness for you. She may derive pleasure from your companionship. But if she maintains no apprehension regarding your potential departure, you occupy an interchangeable position in her existence. However, if she comprehends at her deepest level that you shall not remain in environments lacking proper acknowledgement, you shall never again need to request her focused attention, because she shall become the party struggling to merit yours. This does not constitute ruthlessness. This represents psychological magnetism. This embodies shadowy attraction, and this defines the supremacy of apprehension over affection. Command the perception. The ancient strategist once articulated something devastatingly straightforward and alarmingly accurate. Possessing genuine virtue carries no necessity. Projecting the appearance of virtue carries absolute necessity. This solitary declaration shatters the enchantment under which most males operate throughout their existence. Because from earliest childhood, society indoctrinates us with fabrication. If you demonstrate kindness, faithfulness, industriousness, and truthfulness, others shall grant you reverence. Females shall experience desire toward you. The universe shall compensate you appropriately. Except it shall not, because the external world perceives nothing of your authentic nature. It perceives exclusively your external presentation. You may possess unwavering loyalty. You may possess exceptional intelligence. You may harbor profound principles and honorable intentions, but if you materialize displaying weakened physical carriage, hesitant vocal delivery, and nervous emanation, no observer shall register your intrinsic worth, particularly not a female. Because feminine attraction initiates not with factual assessment, it initiates with perceptual interpretation. Not what characteristics define you, but what sensations arise when she occupies proximity to you. She conducts no analytical examination of your reasoning. She performs environmental scanning of your energetic signature, your locomotive patterns, your verbal delivery, your reactive responses under examination. And this marks the territory where controlled perception transforms into authority. This distinction between authenticity and presentation is not about fabricating a false persona. This distinction centers on strategic framing, because the human consciousness does not respond to objective reality. The human consciousness responds to whatever registers as plausible. And should you neglect to architect your external representation, alternative forces, her psychological patterns, her emotional inclinations, her accumulated experiences shall construct your identity within her perception without your participation. So what manifests in practical application when internal uncertainty dominates your state? Embody the physical demeanor of absolute conviction. When turbulent emotions surge internally, communicate with the vocal characteristics of someone mastering intense feelings. When the impulse to chase her overwhelms your judgment, execute the opposite action. Maintain stillness. Permit her trajectory to redirect toward you, because within motionlessness dwells potency. Within the unknown dwells magnetic attraction. Grant her visibility to approximately 4/5 of your complete self. Conceal the remaining portion behind your gaze. Authorize her imagination to populate the vacant spaces, and whatever she constructs mentally shall frequently surpass anything your articulation could communicate, because the enigmatic exerts profound magnetic pull, and humans pursue what eludes their complete comprehension. They pursue what frustrates their attempts at total understanding. This represents the genesis of obsessive fixation, not through excessive self-disclosure, but through strategic reserve, not through persistent persuasion, but through quiet intentionality. Therefore, cease your attempts at self-justification. Terminate your endeavors toward being perceived and understood. Commence the deliberate construction of your external identity. Because in societies governed by perceptual interpretation, your external presentation transcends mere significance. Your external presentation becomes the entire contest itself, embodies simultaneously the predator and the tactician. Every female will evaluate you, not to inflict suffering, but to identify your fracture point. She shall alter her demeanor. She shall initiate withdrawal. She shall oscillate between emotional coldness and warmth, then return to coldness. She shall articulate one intention whilst executing contrary behavior. And all of this occurs for singular verification. Do you fracture under pressure, or do you maintain structural integrity? The vast majority of males remain entirely unaware they are undergoing assessment. They misinterpret her conduct as confusion or emotional volatility. Consequently, they elaborate, they express regret, they engage verbally in repair attempts, and instantaneously, they forfeit the feeble ATS Anarisagan competition. Yet the historical philosopher provided the strategic blueprint centuries prior. A formidable male must simultaneously function as both predator and strategist. The predator embodies raw capability. He engages in no pursuit. He engages in no justification. He constructs personal parameters exclusively through his silence. He commands environmental respect without vocal elevation. The strategist embodies intellectual acuity. He refuses to take her provocations personally. He maintains concealment regarding his intentions. He perceives and launches counterstrikes during optimal moments. And herein exists the pitfall consuming most males. Should you exclusively manifest as predator, commanding, forthright, forceful, she shall engineer circumstances designed to provoke your eruption. And when you explode, she categorizes you as unstable. Your authority deteriorates into mere clamor. Should you exclusively manifest as strategist, perceptive, serene, calculating, she shall experience your charisma, yet perceive no backbone. And, absent that underlying intensity, she cannot trust your capacity for leadership. Yet if you embody both dimensions, if she observes strength encoded within your restraint and strategic calculation within your deliberate silences, she discovers herself incapable of predicting your actions. And that unpredictability, that underlying tension, that constitutes the mechanism that seals her deeper than any verbal expression could accomplish. So, what methodology accomplishes this dual embodiment? When she exhibits heightened emotional activation, transition into strategist mode, maintain observation, decline reactive response, permit her emotional assertions to crash against your unshakable composure. When she transgresses your established parameters, activate predator mode, not through anger expressions, not through explicit warnings, but through sheer presence, a quietude that telegraphs, "You have encountered my boundary, and I shall not relocate it." That represents the male she reveres, not because you elevate your vocal volume, but because you demonstrate complete absence of flinching, not because you elaborate extensively, but because you maintain no requirement for elaboration. She shall discover herself incapable of manipulating you, because you do not participate in games. You observe, you remain patient, you take meaningful action when circumstances warrant. That constitutes genuine capability. Not theatrical display, not superficial appeal, but the integration of dominance and intelligent restraint. The predator safeguards your dignity and standing. The strategist safeguards your psychological sovereignty. And combined, they render you unforgettable. Fracture her unified perception. The ancient philosopher's most fundamental principle of authority was elegantly uncomplicated. Separate the opposition and overcome them individually. Yet this theory extends beyond military and political conquest. This theory operates silently within individual psychological architecture. You do not dominate a female through coercive methods. You do not oppose her convictions through direct confrontation. You introduce subtle contradiction and permit her consciousness to execute the remainder. Because when a female maintains certainty, she maintains control. She possesses clarity regarding her preferences. She experiences emotional security, feeling anchored. Your objective? Not to demolish her convictions, but to generate uncertainty within her existing framework. Just a single, small deviation from her expectations. Not combative discourse, merely a subtle comment. She articulates, "I find possessive males repulsive." You respond with a gentle smile, relaxed, slightly playful. That represents your current perspective. Now that singular comment generates a microscopic fracture, negligible on appearance, yet profoundly significant beneath the surface. Her consciousness initiates rotation. What did that imply exactly? Do I genuinely maintain that position? For what reason is that statement persisting in my memory? That marks the commencement of internal division, not between the two of you, but internally within her psychological structure. When part of her consciousness continues agreeing with her previous position, yet another portion begins questioning. She surrenders command of her own narrative. And you initiated this psychological shift. This does not constitute domination through forceful imposition. This constitutes domination through psychological pressure. The majority of males sidestep this approach. They immediately capitulate to her perspective, desperate for approval. They construct environments where she experiences confirmation, acceptance, and conviction. Yet conviction generates no attraction. Tension generates attraction. Because when she experiences internal tearing, when she perceives cognitive dissonance, when she experiences doubt, her emotional channels remain operational. And within that operational state, your influence expands. Do not contest her viewpoint. Simply engage her viewpoint once with tranquility. Subsequently, permit quietude to complete the labor. She shall argue with her own cognition, and without conscious awareness, you have implanted yourself within her psychological space, not as antagonist, but as mystery. That defines Machiavellian seduction, not forceful dominance, not theatrical performance. Exact psychological precision, authority that remains invisible because it manifests as intellectual curiosity. And intellectual curiosity, that constitutes the mechanism maintaining her circling around you, even when you communicate absolutely nothing. Distribute gratification incrementally. Administer consequences instantaneously. The historical strategist once articulated, suffering ought to be administered in concentrated bursts, yet advantages ought to be distributed gradually and deliberately. This principle transcends mere political maneuvering. This principle governs emotional manipulation, and its effectiveness in contemporary romantic dynamics surpasses what most recognize. Here exists the fundamental truth. When someone violates your established parameters, you do not indulge in emotionally reactive conduct. You do not engage in argumentative exchanges. You do not justify your position through elaboration. You take decisive corrective action. 1. Singular, methodical maneuver executed with calculated detachment. Withdrawal of communication, physical distance, severing of engagement, without verbal outbursts, without instructional lectures, without guilt-inducing manipulation, exclusively the abrupt termination of your accessible presence. And that disappearance generates pain. For what reason? Because she encounters nothing resistant. She occupies solitude with her own cognitive processes and her accumulated remorse. Her consciousness enters a state of agitation. What transgression did I perpetrate? For what reason has he discontinued interaction? Shall he remain absent indefinitely? And that quietude transforms into a reflective instrument. She confronts her own accountability without your participation. Subsequently emerges the compensatory phase, yet not in comprehensive quantities. When she demonstrates faithfulness, when she exhibits emotional warmth, when she manifests appropriate deference, you distribute something modest, uncommon, genuinely earned. Perhaps a subtle look conveying affection, perhaps a gentle facial expression of approval, perhaps genuine acknowledgement that carries substantive weight. Subsequently, nothing transpires. You do not flood her with romantic gestures. You do not manufacture the impression that you have surrendered completely to her. You reprogram her neurological responses, precisely as a gaming establishment does. She remains perpetually uncertain when the subsequent reward shall materialize. Consequently, she maintains engagement. This mechanism generates the compulsive sensation, not the magnitude of the gratification, but the unpredictable timing. Excessive males invert this sequence entirely. They administer consequences with excessive frequency. They dispense gratification with premature haste. They cycle between emotional extremes, becoming erratic and unsustainable. Yet you adopt an alternative methodology. You administer consequence once, without preliminary warning, without theatrical presentation, exclusively boundaries breached, followed by silence. And when she returns to your psychological framework, you dispense gratification with deliberate restraint, maintaining sufficient allure to sustain her psychological hunger. This does not constitute brutality. This constitutes disciplined execution. This embodies Machiavellian psychological principles wrapped in measured regulation. Because suffering inflicted rapidly embeds itself into recollection, and satisfaction distributed incrementally becomes addictive. Now, you transcend mere individual. You transform into a psychological mechanism she cannot discontinue operating. Observe her behavioral patterns meticulously. Subsequently articulate a single observation. Ordinary males fixate upon feminine physiology. A male operating from Machiavellian principles observes her conduct. He remains unaffected by external beauty. He maintains no visual fixation motivated by carnal desire. He conducts observation with composure and analytical exactitude. He identifies the distinction in her linguistic patterns when positioned with males she genuinely respects versus individuals she psychologically dominates. He documents the minute transformations, the manner in which her vocal characteristics shift, the direction her attention travels, the alterations in her physical arrangement depending upon her audience. He maintains awareness regarding the distinction between her authentic self and her performed presentation. No inquiries posed, no admiration expressed, exclusively attentive presence. Because whilst alternative males endeavor to engage her corpus, he has already infiltrated her psychological architecture. Subsequently, when the optimal instant arrives, not prematurely, not belatedly, precisely when conditions align, he articulates one observation: quiet, exact, devoid of emotional coloration. Your communication patterns transform when he observes you. Or perhaps your laughter carries inauthenticity. No condemnation embedded, no tonal judgment, no facial indication of mockery. Subsequently, quietude. And in that momentary interval, her psychological reality shifts, because that statement did not constitute romantic flattery. That statement did not constitute something she could dismiss casually. That statement represented observation she was unprepared to acknowledge, originating from an individual who did not petition for her authorization. And the female consciousness does not disregard moments like that. It replays them repeatedly. Hold on, for what reason did he perceive that? What additional details remains he identifying? Did my behavior register so plainly? Has he maintained observation this entire duration? Now she experiences no sensation of admiration. She experiences exposure, and not through coercive imposition, not through pressure application, through attentive perception. You did not command her psychological focus. You did not compete for authority. You merely documented what others overlooked and articulated what others lacked the courage to express. That constitutes psychological domination. It maintains no volume. It maintains no belligerence. It maintains quietude that reverberates within her consciousness long after your physical departure. Because when you articulate the solitary element that makes contact with the dimension of her she kept concealed, you mark her permanently. She shall disregard compliments. She shall disregard temporary liaisons. Yet she shall not disregard the male who recognized her protective mechanisms and addressed them, not to devastate her, but to illuminate her existence to herself. You are distinguishable. You do not pursue her external presentation. You perceive the psychological operation supporting it. And the instant she registers that perception, you establish permanent residence within her consciousness. Even when you remove yourself from her perception entirely, Establish command through strategic retreat. Should you remain perpetually obtainable, perpetually receptive, perpetually present, you transition into predictable territory, and predictable constitutes forgettable. Yet when you withdraw without forewarning, without theatrical performance, without explanatory statements, you transform into unforgettable. Not because you inflicted punishment, not because you disregarded her, but because you manufactured a psychological void. And the female consciousness cannot withstand a psychological void. It must populate it. It must comprehend what disappeared and the reason for its disappearance. When you transition into silence, her consciousness amplifies its internal volume beyond anything previously experienced. She replays your preceding interaction. She re-examines every glance, every deliberate pause, every vocabulary element you declined to communicate. She investigates for clues that simply do not exist. Did I perpetrate something inappropriate? For what reason has contact discontinued? Did he merely perform artificial concern? Now she no longer experiences contentment regarding your directed focus. She experiences haunting from your absence, and that constitutes the crucial insight. Because whereas ordinary males elaborate excessively, distribute excessively, maintain excessive presence, you vanish, without farewell declarations, without interpersonal conflict, not to generate suffering, but to generate atmospheric space. And within that atmospheric space, she constructs an imaginative interpretation of you. She recollects you not as you existed, but as something more expansive, more detached, progressively commanding. Now you transcend mere individual participant. You metamorphose into an unresolved enigma, a psychological phenomenon lacking completion. This does not constitute brutality. This constitutes psychological juxtaposition. You transmit warmth, subsequently retrieve it. You demonstrate availability, subsequently recede into obscurity. And that oscillation, that psychological turbulence, penetrates more profoundly than any complimentary statement could accomplish. Yet attend carefully. You do not vanish motivated by fury. You do not deploy this as manipulative methodology. You deploy this when your contributed value experiences disregard. Because calibration remains significant. Withdrawal maintains potency exclusively when presence maintained previous significance. And when you resurface displaying emotional stability, unaffected emotionally, maintaining psychological equilibrium, she shall not greet you with antagonism. She shall greet you with intellectual curiosity and underlying apprehension, because she has internalized that you possess capacity to withdraw at any moment without psychological fracture. That does not constitute psychological control. That constitutes gravitational force. And gravitational force does not pursue, it attracts. Therefore, withdraw for precisely sufficient duration that she speculates whether she ever genuinely maintained you to begin with. Most males chase feminine attention with gifts, looks, or loud charm, which is why they are forgotten quickly. The objective is not admiration, but permanent psychological residence. You aim to command the emotional climate she inhabits after you leave, using quiet frameworks that ignite fixation without pursuit, flattery, or pleading. First, apprehension outranks affection. Warmth feels pleasant yet becomes background noise when offered endlessly. Reverence appears when she knows your presence can disappear. You hold firm boundaries, avoid arguments, and simply withdraw when disrespected. The pain of losing access to you imprints more deeply than any extra generosity. She may like you, yet if she does not fear losing you, you remain replaceable. Second, control perception. Reality does not matter if it is never perceived. You may hold virtue and intelligence, but attraction begins with how you move, speak, and respond under pressure. Present composure when you feel uncertain, stillness when you feel the urge to chase, and mystery instead of full disclosure. Show most of yourself, conceal the remainder, and let her imagination work harder than your explanations. Third, embody predator and tactician together. The predator enforces limits without pleading, volume, or pursuit. The tactician observes, tests, stays calm, and chooses timing. One without the other turns you either unstable or passive. Combined, They generate tension because she cannot easily predict you. Fourth, fracture her certainty and manage reinforcement. You do not debate aggressively. You introduce small contradictions, then let silence turn in her mind. You give consequences once through clean withdrawal, then return measured rewards slowly when respect and loyalty reappear, creating powerful anticipation. Finally, cultivate forensic attention and strategic retreat. Study her patterns, then deliver a single, accurate observation that exposes what she hides from herself. Withdraw only when your value is taken for granted. Return steady and unaffected, and position yourself as the turning point in her story. You no longer compete for her focus. You become the psychological force she cannot forget or replace.